In the bell towers of ancient churches and cathedrals across Europe and Asia, massive bronze instruments hang in silent testimony to the skill of craftsmen who lived centuries ago. When struck, these bells produce sounds of extraordinary beauty and complexity, their tones reverberating across valleys and cities, calling the faithful to prayer, marking the hours of the day, and announcing events of great importance to communities that depended on their voices. Some of these bells have rung for 500 years or more, their metal surfaces worn smooth by centuries of use, their voices unchanged since the day they were first cast. The patina of age covers their surfaces in shades of green and brown, while inscriptions in Latin, Cyrillic, or other ancient scripts circle their shoulders like crowns of frozen prayer. In recent years, a curious theory has emerged suggesting that these ancient bells were not merely musical instruments but repositories of forbidden technology, devices that harnessed mysterious forms of energy unknown to modern science. According to this theory, the bells of the lost empire of Tartaria possessed acoustic properties that cannot be explained by conventional physics, suggesting that their creators had access to knowledge that has since been suppressed or forgotten. But the science of acoustics, metallurgy, and bell casting tells a different and far more fascinating story. These ancient instruments are indeed remarkable achievements of human ingenuity, but their properties can be fully explained by the physics of sound and the chemistry of bronze. Understanding how they actually work reveals a narrative more impressive than any fantasy of hidden technology could ever be. The art of bell making is one of the oldest and most sophisticated forms of metalworking known to human civilization, stretching back to the dawn of the Bronze Age itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that bells were being cast in bronze as early as 3,000 years ago in China, where they played important roles in religious ceremonies, court rituals, and elaborate musical performances. The ancient Chinese developed sets of tuned bells called bianzhong, which were played in orchestras and buried in the tombs of nobles and emperors. These instruments demonstrated remarkable acoustic sophistication, with some bells capable of producing two distinct pitches depending on where they were struck. The technology spread gradually across Asia along trade routes and through cultural exchange, eventually reaching Europe through intermediaries who adapted it to local materials and traditions. In Europe, the craft was refined and developed over centuries into a highly specialized trade, concentrated in a small number of workshops that guarded their techniques as closely as any military secret. By the medieval period, European bell founders had achieved a level of skill that has rarely been surpassed in the centuries since, creating instruments of remarkable size, beauty, and acoustic quality that continue to ring in cathedrals and churches to this day. The largest of these bells weighed tens of thousands of pounds and required years of preparation and the coordinated labor of dozens of craftsmen to produce. Their creation was considered both an art and a science, combining empirical knowledge passed down through generations of masters with an intuitive understanding of materials and acoustics that could only be gained through hands-on experience in the foundry. The mystery that attracts conspiracy theorists to ancient bells centers on their acoustic properties, which can indeed seem almost magical to those unfamiliar with the physics of sound and vibration. A well-made bell does not simply produce a single note when struck, as a tuning fork or a piano string might do. Instead, it generates a complex cascade of tones that interact with one another in intricate patterns, creating the rich, shimmering sound that makes bells so distinctive and so emotionally powerful. This phenomenon, known technically as the strike tone and its associated partials, results from the way vibrations propagate through the bell's curved surface after the initial impact of the clapper. Different parts of the bell vibrate at different frequencies simultaneously, producing harmonics that blend together into a unified but complex sound. The lowest tone, called the hum note, vibrates at a frequency below the perceived pitch of the bell and gives the sound its depth and fullness. Above this are the prime, the tierce, the quint, and the nominal, each contributing to the overall character of the bell's voice. The specific pattern of these harmonics depends on the bell's shape, size, thickness at various points, and the precise composition of the metal from which it is made. Master bell founders learned to control these variables through centuries of trial and error, developing proportions and alloys that produced the most pleasing and harmonious combinations of tones. Their knowledge was empirical rather than theoretical, based on careful observation of what worked rather than on formal scientific understanding derived from first principles. But the results they achieved were no less impressive for being arrived at through practical experimentation rather than mathematical calculation. The composition of bell metal is one of the most important factors in determining a bell's acoustic properties and longevity. Traditional bell bronze consists of approximately 78% copper and 22% tin, a ratio that has remained essentially unchanged for centuries because it produces a metal with exceptional resonance, durability, and casting properties. This alloy is significantly harder and more brittle than pure copper, which might seem like a disadvantage but actually proves essential for acoustic performance. The hardness allows the metal to vibrate freely without absorbing the energy of the vibrations into internal friction, which would quickly dampen the sound and produce a dull, unsatisfying tone. When struck, a bell made from proper bell bronze continues to ring for an extended period, sometimes for a minute or more. It sounds slowly fading as the energy dissipates into the surrounding air through acoustic radiation. The specific ratio of copper to tin was determined through centuries of experimentation, as bell founders discovered through direct experience that small variations in composition produced significant and often unexpected changes in sound quality. Too much tin made the bell excessively brittle and prone to cracking under the repeated stress of ringing. Too little tin produced a dull, muffled tone that did not carry well across the distances bells were intended to span. The optimal ratio was not calculated from metallurgical theory but discovered through the patient work of craftsmen who cast bell after bell, listening carefully to the results and adjusting their recipes accordingly until they found formulations that consistently produced excellent results. The shape of a bell is equally important in determining its acoustic character, and the distinctive profile of a European church bell represents the accumulated wisdom of countless experiments conducted over many generations. That familiar silhouette, with its flared lip and gracefully curved shoulder tapering to a flat crown, evolved over centuries as founders experimented with different forms and observed their effects on sound quality. Early medieval bells were often crude in shape, with thick walls, irregular profiles, and poorly controlled proportions that produced harsh, dissonant sounds unpleasant to refined ears. By the 15th and 16th centuries, founders had developed the elegant proportions that characterized the finest examples of the craft, with precisely calculated curves that produced harmonious combinations of tones pleasing to the ear and suitable for musical performance. The thickness of the bell varies at different points along its profile, being thickest at the sound bow near the lip where the clapper strikes and transmits its energy, and becoming progressively thinner toward the shoulder and crown where the metal must be light enough to vibrate freely. These carefully designed variations in thickness affect the frequencies at which different parts of the bell vibrate, and skilled founders learn to manipulate them to achieve specific acoustic effects tailored to the intended use of the instrument. The geometry of bell design became a closely guarded trade secret, passed down from master to apprentice within families and guilds that dominated the craft for generations and jealously protected their competitive advantages. The claim that ancient bells contain forbidden technology often focuses on their supposed ability to produce frequencies or effects that modern science cannot explain through conventional physics. Proponents of this theory point to accounts of bells that could be heard from extraordinary distances far beyond what seems possible, bells whose sounds had healing or protective properties that affected those who heard them, and bells that seemed to resonate with the energy of the earth itself in ways that transcended mere acoustic vibration. These claims are typically based on legends, folklore, and misinterpretations of historical accounts rather than on direct physical evidence that can be examined and verified. When examined scientifically using modern instruments and analytical techniques, the acoustic properties of ancient bells prove to be entirely consistent with the known physics of vibrating metal objects. There is no mysterious energy emanating from their bronze surfaces, no hidden frequency that eludes scientific detection, no forgotten technology that modern researchers cannot understand or replicate. There is only bronze, shaped with extraordinary skill by craftsmen who understood their materials deeply, vibrating according to the same laws of physics that govern all material objects in the universe. The distance at which a bell can be heard depends on several well-understood factors that acousticians have studied extensively, including the size and mass of the bell, the force with which it is struck, the acoustic properties of the surrounding environment, and atmospheric conditions at the time of ringing. Large bells produce lower frequencies that travel farther than the higher frequencies of smaller bells, because low-frequency sound waves are less readily absorbed by the atmosphere and less easily blocked by obstacles such as buildings and terrain features. Sound also travels farther in certain atmospheric conditions, such as cool, still air over water or open ground, and can be channeled by geographic features such as valleys that act as natural amplifiers. The famous Great Bell of Moscow, the Tsar Kolokol, was designed to produce a sound that would carry across the entire city and into the surrounding countryside, its massive size generating the deep tones necessary for long-distance propagation. Unfortunately, this bell cracked during a fire before it was ever raised into position and rung, but similar bells in functioning condition around the world demonstrate that the acoustic principles involved are sound and well understood. There is nothing supernatural about the ability of large bells to be heard from great distances. It is a straightforward consequence of acoustic physics operating according to principles that can be demonstrated in any physics laboratory. The supposed healing or protective properties attributed to certain bells in folklore represent a different category of claim, one that mixes religious belief, cultural tradition, and physical speculation in ways that require careful untangling. In many cultures across the world, the sound of bells was believed to drive away evil spirits, protect against storms and natural disasters, ward off plague and pestilence, and purify the air of harmful influences. These beliefs were widespread in medieval Europe, where church bells were often inscribed with prayers and invocations and blessed by priests or bishops in elaborate ceremonies before being installed in their towers. The ringing of bells during thunderstorms was thought to prevent lightning strikes by disrupting the malevolent forces that caused them, and special bells were rung during epidemics to cleanse the air of disease-causing miasmas that were believed to spread illness through corrupted atmosphere. These practices reflected the worldview of their time, which understood disease, weather, and misfortune in terms of spiritual forces and supernatural causation rather than natural processes governed by physical laws. The bells themselves had no actual power to affect these phenomena, as we now understand from modern meteorology and epidemiology. But the communities that rang them believed otherwise, and this belief was meaningful and important in its own right as an expression of faith, community solidarity, and the human desire for agency in the face of terrifying natural forces. Understanding these practices requires historical and anthropological analysis, not appeals to forbidden physics or suppressed technology. The metallurgical skill required to cast a large bell successfully was genuinely remarkable by any standard, ancient or modern, and deserves appreciation on its own terms without embellishment from conspiracy theories. The process began with the construction of a mold, which consisted of an inner core and an outer cope separated by a space in the exact shape of the desired bell. The core was built up from brick and clay around a wooden spindle or central axis, shaped using a template called a crook or sweep that defined the inner profile of the bell and ensured perfect symmetry as it was rotated around the axis. This core had to be dried slowly and thoroughly to prevent cracking and to ensure that it would withstand the thermal shock of receiving molten metal. Once the core was complete and properly seasoned, a layer of wax, tallow, or a mixture of both was applied over its surface in the exact thickness of the intended bell wall. This wax layer was carefully smoothed and finished, and any inscriptions, decorations, or raised elements were modeled in wax and attached to it. The outer cope was then built around this wax model, again using templates and careful measurement to ensure the correct shape. The completed mold was heated gradually to melt and drain out the wax, leaving a hollow space between core and cope in the precise shape of the finished bell. This lost wax casting technique required extraordinary precision at every stage, as any irregularities in the mold would be faithfully reproduced in the finished bell and could not be corrected afterward. The founders who perfected this technique over generations were masters of their craft, but they were not wielding forbidden technology handed down from a lost civilization. They were applying practical knowledge accumulated over generations of trial, error, careful observation, and incremental refinement. The pouring of the molten metal was the most dangerous and dramatically intense moment in the entire casting process, when the work of months or even years could be ruined in minutes by a single mistake. Bronze must be heated to approximately 1000 degrees Celsius to become fully liquid and flow freely enough to fill every detail of the mold, and the molten metal must be poured quickly and continuously to prevent cold shuts, incomplete fills, and other defects that would ruin the bell. For large bells weighing thousands of pounds, this required the coordinated effort of many workers, each responsible for a specific task in a carefully choreographed sequence that had been planned and rehearsed in advance. The metal was typically melted in multiple furnaces positioned around the casting pit and channeled into the mold through a system of runners and gates designed to distribute it evenly and prevent turbulence that could introduce air bubbles. As the metal cooled and solidified over hours and days, it contracted slightly, and the founders had to account for this shrinkage in their mold design to achieve the intended final dimensions. A bell that cooled too quickly might develop internal stresses that would cause it to crack when struck, sometimes immediately and sometimes only after years of service. A bell that cooled unevenly might have acoustic properties that differed unexpectedly from what was intended. Managing these thermal dynamics required skill, experience, and intuitive judgment that could only be gained through years of apprenticeship under a master who had learned the same lessons from his own master before him. Once the bell was cast and cooled completely, which could take days or weeks for the largest examples, it had to be removed from its mold and finished to its final state. The outer cope was broken away carefully with hammers and chisels, revealing the rough surface of the bronze casting with its seams, sprues, and surface irregularities. The core was dug out laboriously from the inside of the bell, a dusty and difficult task in a confined space. The bell was then carefully cleaned, any casting defects were filed or ground away by skilled metalworkers, and inscriptions or decorations were chased and refined to their final appearance. Finally, the bell was tested for sound quality, typically by suspending it temporarily and striking it with hammers of various sizes while experienced founders listened critically to the resulting tones. If the sound was satisfactory and matched the intended character, the bell was ready for installation in its tower. If not, it might be tuned by carefully removing small amounts of metal from specific locations on the interior surface, a delicate process requiring intimate knowledge of the relationship between shape and sound that could only be gained through long experience. In the most unfortunate cases, the bell had to be melted down and recast from the beginning, a costly and time-consuming setback that founders worked very hard to avoid through careful attention to every stage of the process. The acoustic physics that governs bell sounds was not formally understood in mathematical terms until the 19th and 20th centuries, when scientists began to apply the tools of physics and mathematics to the vibrations of curved surfaces. The pioneering work of Lord Rayleigh in England and other physicists of his era established the theoretical framework for understanding why bells sound the way they do, identifying the specific vibrational modes that produce the various partials heard in a bell's voice and developing equations that could predict acoustic behavior from physical measurements. This scientific understanding came centuries after the finest bells had already been cast by craftsmen who knew nothing of wave equations or harmonic analysis, demonstrating that practical skill can sometimes outpace theoretical knowledge by a considerable margin. The medieval and Renaissance founders who created acknowledged masterpieces of the bell-making art did not know the mathematical formulas that describe what they were doing, but they understood the practical principles deeply through long experience and acute observation. Their bells conform perfectly to the laws of physics that were only later discovered and formalized, because those laws describe the reality in which all craftsmen work, not because the founders had access to some secret science that has since been lost or suppressed. The idea that Tartarian bells contained forbidden technology reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how historical knowledge actually works and how traditional crafts develop and decline over time. The theory assumes that any skill or achievement not immediately explicable by the observer must involve hidden or suppressed knowledge, rather than simply knowledge that the observer happens to lack or that has been lost through the normal processes of cultural change. In reality, many traditional crafts have declined or disappeared as the economic and social conditions that supported them changed, not because anyone deliberately suppressed them. The skills of master bell founders were passed down through apprenticeship within a small number of specialized workshops, and as demand for new bells decreased in the modern era with changing religious practices and competition from electronic alternatives, fewer young people entered the trade. Some techniques were lost simply because no one was left who knew them and no written records preserved the details adequately for recreation. This is the normal process of cultural change and knowledge transmission, not evidence of a conspiracy to hide forbidden technology from the public. The bells that survive from earlier centuries can be examined, measured, and analyzed using modern scientific instruments with capabilities far beyond anything available to the original craftsmen. Researchers have studied the acoustic properties of famous bells using sensitive microphones, spectrum analyzers, and sophisticated computer modeling software, mapping the precise frequencies produced and comparing them systematically to theoretical predictions based on physical measurements of the bells themselves. These studies consistently show that the bells behave exactly as the physics of vibrating metal predicts they should, with no anomalous frequencies that defy explanation, no unexplained energy emanating from their surfaces, and no evidence of any technology beyond skilled metallurgy and empirical design refined over generations. The Great Bell of Kiev, the bells of the Cologne Cathedral, the carillons of Belgium and the Netherlands, the ancient temple bells of Japan, all of these instruments have been subjected to scientific scrutiny by acousticians and musicologists, and all of them have proved to be exactly what they appear to be: masterfully crafted bronze instruments operating according to the ordinary laws of acoustics that govern all vibrating objects. The cultural significance of bells in traditional societies extended far beyond their practical function as timekeepers, signaling devices, or musical instruments. Bells were invested with profound symbolic meaning by the communities they served, believed to possess personality, spiritual power, and even agency in the world. They were given individual names, baptized in solemn ceremonies modeled on the Christian sacraments for human children, and treated as honored members of the community they served with their voices. When a great bell cracked or failed after centuries of service, it was mourned as a genuine loss, sometimes with public ceremonies and memorial inscriptions. When a new bell was installed in a tower, it was celebrated with festivals, processions, and feasting that might continue for days. This rich cultural context gave bells a significance that transcended their physical properties as vibrating bronze objects, making them objects of reverence, affection, and sometimes superstitious fear. Stories about bells with magical properties reflect this deep cultural investment in their meaning, not any actual supernatural capabilities inherent in the metal itself. The bells themselves are physical objects that vibrate when struck according to the laws of physics. The magic exists in the human imagination that perceives meaning, power, and personality in their sounds and shapes. In Russia and other Orthodox Christian lands, bells played a particularly important and distinctive role in religious and civic life that differed in significant ways from Western European practice. Russian bells are technically different from their Western European counterparts, being designed to remain stationary while external clappers or swinging beams strike their surfaces, rather than swinging themselves to bring internal clappers against their sides. This produces a different style of ringing that allows for more complex rhythmic patterns and the simultaneous sounding of multiple bells in coordinated sequences. Russian bells also tend to have different proportions and alloys than Western bells, often incorporating small amounts of silver or gold donated by the faithful, producing sounds that are distinctively rich, complex, and recognizably Russian in character. The tradition of Russian bell founding reached its height in the 17th and 18th centuries, when masters created instruments of extraordinary size and beauty that became symbols of national and religious identity. These bells were no more mysterious than their Western counterparts in terms of their physical operation, but they were adapted to a different liturgical tradition and aesthetic sensibility that valued their distinctive voice. The Tsar Kolokol, or King of Bells, in Moscow represents perhaps the most famous example of Russian bell founding, though ironically it has never been rung and never will be. Cast in 1735 by master founders Ivan and Mikhail Motorin, this enormous bell weighs over 200,000 kilograms and stands over 6 meters tall, making it the largest bell ever successfully cast by a considerable margin. It cracked during a catastrophic fire in 1737, before it could be raised into its intended bell tower, when firefighters poured cold water on the heated metal to prevent it from melting completely. This thermal shock caused a massive piece weighing over 11,000 kilograms to break away from the side, rendering the bell unringable. It has remained on display in the Kremlin as a monument ever since, visited by millions of tourists who marvel at its size and regret the accident that silenced it forever. The crack was caused by well-understood thermal dynamics, the same principles that cause glass to shatter when subjected to rapid temperature changes. There is no mysterious explanation required. The bell itself is an extraordinary achievement of casting technology, representing the absolute upper limit of what was possible with the techniques and materials available in the 18th century. But it is not evidence of forbidden technology. It is evidence of enormous ambition, remarkable skill, and ultimately, tragic misfortune. The theory of forbidden technology in ancient bells often connects to broader narratives about the lost empire of Tartaria and the supposed suppression of advanced knowledge by modern authorities seeking to conceal humanity's true history. According to these narratives, the Tartarian civilization possessed technologies far beyond what mainstream history acknowledges, including acoustic devices that could manipulate matter, transmit energy without wires, or produce effects that modern physics cannot explain or replicate. Bells are incorporated into this narrative as surviving examples of this lost technology, their acoustic properties supposedly demonstrating capabilities beyond what conventional physics can account for through ordinary vibration and wave propagation. But this argument commits a fundamental error of reasoning that undermines its entire foundation. It assumes that anything not immediately understood by the person making the claim must be unexplainable by science in general, when in reality the science of acoustics is highly developed and fully capable of explaining how bells work in complete detail. The gap is in the claimant's knowledge, not in the scientific understanding of acoustics. The study of musical acoustics has advanced enormously over the past century, driven by both pure scientific curiosity about sound and practical applications in instrument design, concert hall architecture, recording technology, and audio engineering. Researchers have developed sophisticated mathematical models of how sound is produced by vibrating objects of all kinds, including bells, and these models accurately predict the behavior of real instruments with remarkable precision. Computer simulations can now predict the sound a bell will produce before it is even cast, allowing modern founders to design instruments with specific acoustic properties tailored to particular musical or liturgical requirements. This capability represents a genuine advance beyond what traditional craftsmen could achieve through trial and error alone, but it builds directly on the same fundamental physics that governed their work without their conscious understanding. The principles are not new discoveries that reveal the inadequacy of previous knowledge. Only the mathematical and computational tools for understanding and applying them in design have changed. The fascination with ancient bells reflects a broader cultural tendency to romanticize the past and to assume that earlier civilizations possessed knowledge that has since been lost through catastrophe or conspiracy. This tendency is understandable given the genuine achievements of past cultures and the real losses that have occurred as traditional crafts declined in the face of industrialization and changing economic conditions. But it can lead to the mistaken assumption that any impressive achievement from the past must involve mysterious or suppressed knowledge, rather than simply the application of skills that were once common but are now rare. The craftsmen who cast the great bells of Europe and Asia were not magicians or custodians of forbidden secrets from a vanished civilization. They were skilled workers who learned their demanding trade through years of practice under experienced masters and who applied their hard-won knowledge to create objects of beauty and utility. Their achievements deserve admiration on their own terms as examples of human skill and dedication, not distortion through the lens of conspiracy theories that misunderstand both science and history. The acoustic properties of bells continue to be studied by scientists and appreciated by musicians and communities around the world, forming a living tradition that connects the present to the deep past. Campanology, the formal study of bells and bell ringing, is an active field that combines historical research into past practices with acoustic science and the practical skills of ringing and maintaining bell installations. Campanologists document historic bells before they are lost to damage or neglect, analyze their properties using modern instruments, and work to preserve the traditions of bell founding and bell ringing for future generations. Their work demonstrates conclusively that there is no conflict between scientific understanding and deep appreciation of traditional crafts. The more scientists understand about how bells work at a physical level, the more impressive the achievements of traditional founders become in retrospect. Science does not diminish the wonder of these magnificent instruments. It deepens appreciation by revealing the full extent of the skill and knowledge that went into their creation using only the empirical methods available at the time. The claim that ancient bells contain forbidden technology ultimately reflects a failure of imagination, an inability to believe that ordinary human beings using ordinary materials could create objects of extraordinary beauty and acoustic complexity through patience, skill, and accumulated wisdom. But the entire history of human craftsmanship shows that this is exactly what humans have done again and again, across cultures and centuries and continents. From the pyramids of Egypt to the cathedrals of Europe, from the silk textiles of China to the astronomical observatories of the Maya, human beings have achieved remarkable things using nothing more than the materials at hand, the knowledge passed down from their predecessors, and the creativity and determination that characterize the human species at its best. The bells that ring in towers around the world are part of this grand tradition of human achievement, monuments to skill and perseverance that require no supernatural explanation and are diminished by attempts to attribute them to sources other than human hands and minds. The next time a great bell rings out across a city, calling people to worship or marking another hour in the endless flow of time, listeners might pause to consider the full journey of what they are hearing. The sound that reaches their ears began as mechanical energy transmitted from the clapper to the bell's bronze surface at the moment of impact, setting the metal vibrating in complex patterns that involve millions of atoms moving in coordinated waves. Those vibrations propagate through the air as pressure waves, traveling at approximately 340 meters per second until they reach the listener's eardrums. The ear converts these pressure waves into neural signals that travel to the brain, where they are interpreted as sound and trigger emotional and cognitive responses shaped by culture, personal memory, and the unique history of each individual listener. Every step of this process is understood by science, from the metallurgy of bronze to the physics of wave propagation to the neuroscience of auditory perception. And yet the sound remains beautiful, mysterious, and emotionally powerful, capable of moving listeners to tears or joy or quiet contemplation. Scientific understanding does not diminish the experience of hearing a great bell ring across the rooftops. It reveals the extraordinary depth of ingenuity and artistry that made such experiences possible in the first place. The bells of the past were not products of forbidden technology from a hidden civilization. They were products of human civilization at its most skilled and devoted, and they deserve to be understood and appreciated for what they truly are.